wonderful to see everybody, and I think people are continuing to I just let one more person in, so hopefully people will continue to join us. So yes, we have a number of burning issues. The most burning of all is clearly these massive demonstrations that have been going on in Israel for weeks now. They started actually 3 months ago, about 3 months ago, shortly after the new government was installed. And they've gotten much crazier since then. So we're going to discuss that. And we also have a bit of good news that came in from last night. But before we start, I'd like to just share a bit of a Bible message, shall we say? It's and usually I end with this, but this time I want to start with it. It will hopefully, keep us in context, whatever we discuss about Israel. So I like to revert to the Torah portion. Now, the Torah portion that we read this past Shabbat. Now, we are on a Tuesday, and Tuesday is really quite in the middle. And so on a Tuesday, it's very easy to talk about the Torah portion that was from a few days ago, or we talk about the Torah portion that is coming up in a few days. And so I'm going to actually talk about both. This past Shabbat, we finished the book of Exodus. And this coming Shabbat, we are going to start the book of Leviticus. And there's just a beautiful, beautiful thought here that I would love to share. It's not mine, but it is just beautiful. So as you know, at the very end of Exodus, we are completing, after we spent chapters and chapters discussing the tabernacle, the details, how to build it, who participates in it, all the different things that they have to know. And then the last few chapters, when they do actually build it, the book of Exodus ends where Moses finished the job and the tabernacle is up. And then it says as follows, in verse 34, the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And then we have a couple of verses that talk about the use of the cloud and the fire to indicate travel and to protect the nation. And it says, for over the tabernacle, a cloud of the Lord rested by day, and a fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. And that's how the book of Exodus ends. And it definitely represents to us this idea the cloud and the fire are representations of God's protection and God's presence. The cloud filling the tabernacle is said here, it says the cloud covered the tent of meeting. So that's a physical view. We see a cloud right there covering the tent of meeting. But the next words tell us, what does that cloud represent? And the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Okay, it's not just a cloud, it's not a rain cloud. That's not what this is about. It's a physical manifestation of the fact that God now has enabled his presence to fill the tabernacle. But this next verse is what's really weird. Moses then could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it. So there's something about the presence of God filling the tabernacle that prevents Moses from entering. So you could say, well, okay, maybe it's crowded in there. All right. If God is filling the tabernacle, there's like no room for anybody else. Well, I'm sure we wouldn't mean that physically, but there's a spiritual element in there of that where God is, God takes up the whole space. I mean, again, we're talking spiritually. I'm not trying to talk physically, but if we believe that God is everywhere, God's presence is literally everywhere. There's no limit to his presence. Okay, so then the question becomes, well, if that's the case, what space is there for mankind? Okay, if God is everywhere, what's our role as human beings? Do we have a role? If God's in charge of everything, what does he need man? He clearly doesn't need man. Okay, but this is that representation. But then you go into the beginning of Leviticus, and how does Leviticus begin? The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them. And then it goes on to talk about details of sacrifice. So this commentator talks about the fact that you can see these two the end of Exodus and the beginning of Leviticus together. Then on the one hand, the cloud has filled the tent of meeting, and Moses is saying, where's my space? Where's any human space? But then what happens in Leviticus is God reaches out to Moses, representing not just Moses, but to mankind. God reaches out to us and beckons us to enter. He makes space for us. Does God need us? No, he doesn't need us, but yet he makes space for us. He beckons us to come in, and then of course begins this, conversation where God is really telling Moses all the laws of the tabernacle. What is he really telling him? This is what your job is in mankind. Your job is to serve God. Your job is to pray. God doesn't need your service. God doesn't need your prayer, but this is the role that has been designated to mankind. Yes, you can say God runs the world and we don't have to do anything, but no, God has given a role to mankind. And in this case, he is telling Moses of these instructions. Now look at the very first thing he instructs him. He says, and here I want to be very precise when I talk about the translation, because the translation is a little bit different. The translation says, when any of you presents an offering of cattle or whatever, okay. But if you look at the words themselves, it says, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban, a person who will sacrifice amongst you a sacrifice. I mean, so in good English, you're going to say, you're not going to sacrifice a sacrifice. You would say, bring a sacrifice. But in Hebrew, it actually means a person who will sacrifice a sacrifice. The word sacrifice itself, yakriv, comes from the root word karev, which means close, okay? And those words are very connected, because what God is giving Moses now is the recipe. How can man come close to God? And the key to man coming close to God is his willingness to sacrifice. He must be willing to give of himself, to give up something in order to come close to God. And I think this is a very powerful message, and I want us to keep this message in mind as we discuss the events that we're going to be talking about today. Because it is no secret that there's a lot of discord and tension going on in Israel today. And it's extremely disturbing. It is painful to me and to everyone I know. And we cannot simply dismiss it as a political debate. There is a political debate, and that is something we will discuss. But beyond the political debate, we are one people. And God expects us to come before him in unity. And he needs us, not that he needs us for himself, he needs us to be fulfilling our role on earth. And our role on earth is to serve God, to make this world a better place, to fulfill his commandments. And the only way we can do that is if we come in unity. And sometimes coming before God in unity means sacrificing. Sometimes we have to compromise. Sometimes we have to restrict ourselves. We may be right, but sometimes we have to be willing to engage other people so that we are able to understand where they're coming from and come together in unity. So that is a message I wanted to bring to you today before we launch this whole very problematic issue of the demonstrations in judicial reform. So first of all, just a brief overview. What is judicial reform and why do we need it? The Supreme Court of Israel, and that is really the focus of the judicial reform, has been on the Supreme Court because that's the ultimate court and where appeals end up and all kinds of other cases end up, and particularly the kind of cases that have been of great concern to us in judicial, and what has fueled the judicial reform is a certain type of a case that is called in common law, and I'm sure you have the same term in Australia, cases of equity. And that includes if the government does something that is harmful to an individual citizen, that citizen has the right, and this is the case in all countries that came out of the common law, United States, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, etc. They have a right, a citizen has a right to appeal to a Supreme Court or to some other special court for this purpose in order to ask for redress, to ask to help their rights. Okay. By the way, Deborah, I see you have raised your hand. Is that on purpose? No. Okay. So we can put that down. All right. Anyway, so all right. So what has happened though is that in Israel, the Supreme Court has taken for itself, in many ways, authorities and jurisdictions way beyond anything that was ever given to it. So, for example, in most countries, you, an individual citizen, let's say a law is passed and you feel that you have been particularly damaged by that law. Perhaps the law discriminates against you in an unfair way. And so you have the ability to sue the government, as it would, to change that situation. In most countries, the only way a person can bring a case like this against the government or against a particular law is if they're personally injured by it. In Israel, that's called standing. And in Israel, that has been expanded so that anybody who thinks that a particular law may offend, injure, discriminate against a particular person, they can bring that case. So this has already expanded the jurisdiction of the court way beyond anything that we ever had. In addition, they don't have to show real damages. They don't have to show, yes, this person, they had to pay an extra 2,000 shekel because of this law that wasn't fair. No, they can just come. And what has this done? This has opened up the court. And a third thing, the court has opened itself up to petitions, not just by citizens, but by anyone in Israel, including the Arabs, the Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria. Now, I am in favor of opening the court to Palestinians in Judea and Samaria so that they do have the ability to bring their grievances before a court. But it needs to be their grievances. It needs to be, Mr. Palestinian, someone took my land. I need to have redress. I need to be able to go to a court. I'm all in favor of that. What has happened, though, is that there are all these nonprofit organizations that every time something happens in Judea and Samaria, and this is just one example, that they feel is not nice for the Arabs, even if they can't prove that a particular incident has harmed somebody, or they don't even know who the Arab is that might have been harmed, they could bring a case. And the case is brought by X nonprofit organization, and the court decides it. This kind of thing is absolutely not accepted in any other country, this kind of widespread use. But even more than that, the Knesset of Israel, the parliament, will pass all kinds of laws. Because the Knesset, the majority of which stands behind this law, these people were elected to put forth certain policies. In order to affect policies, you have to pass laws. And when they pass laws, very often, again, some nonprofit organization will petition the Supreme Court and say, this law is bad. Why is the law bad? Because it offends the rights of citizens, or it offends the rights of peoples, or whatever. One example of that was, for years, we had a serious immigration crisis. We had illegal immigrants crossing in from Africa. And as Netanyahu said himself once many years ago, he said, Israel's the only country, only Western country in walking distance from Africa. Now, Africa is a very problematic place. I personally don't want to live in most African countries. On the other hand, we, the little teeny Israel, cannot solve Africa's problems. So if there's a civil war here, or if there's drought there, we're happy to help in any way we can. But we cannot open our doors full scale to anybody who feels like life in Israel will be easier. So until we actually built a fence, a barrier that prevented them physically from coming, this was a huge problem. So the Knesset, with amazing majorities, passed a series of legislations each time that would enable the country to send these people back or to send them somewhere else. Now, I'm not talking about those with official refugee status. If someone with an official refugee status is defined by the UN, you cannot send them back, and that's fair. Someone who personally has been persecuted or whatever. But everybody who decides Israel will give them a better way of life is not a refugee. And every time the Knesset passed this kind of legislation, the Supreme Court knocked it down. And they said it wasn't good for people, it wasn't people's dignity, I mean, all kinds of reasons. Now, there's a balance here that has to be struck, okay? Israel is a democratic country, but it's also a Jewish country. And so this immigration issue is not just an economic issue, it's also, and I would say foremost, it's a demographic issue. We are a Jewish country. Any Jew can come to Israel and become an immediate citizen. Other people have to go through the hoops. And it's very difficult for a non-Jew to become a citizen of Israel. And that's the way it needs to be, because otherwise, especially now, I have to tell you, when the state of Israel was established, nobody dreamed that Israel would be an attractive place for anybody who isn't Jewish. They would never dream it. And so this is a modern problem, which is, in a way, it's a blessing that Israel is now the kind of country that is economically comfortable. People want to live here, good life, good beaches, whatever. But we have to make sure that it's a Jewish country and that it doesn't become just some kind of country that's no different from Australia or New Zealand or anywhere else. And of course, everybody is always welcome to visit, but being a citizen is a whole different thing. Being a permanent resident is a whole different thing. Anyway, so these are just two examples of where the Supreme Court was able, by its decisions, to overturn laws that were passed by a majority of the Knesset. Now, this doctrine, this whole change of the Supreme Court happened like some 20 years ago when the Chief Justice was someone named Aaron Barak. And when he started ruling in this way, there were some very significant Supreme Court justices who were very much against it. But over the years, he gained his majority and was able to affect this policy. Why? Because over the years, and for many years, even from its inception, the Supreme Court becomes an old boys club. Although there are a few women in it too. But it's more or less the way the appointment of judges is done. It is done in such a way that an automatic majority is given to the Supreme Court judges themselves. So what has happened is the Supreme Court judges who are overwhelmingly liberal, there are a few conservative judges on the court, most of whom have been appointed in recent years. But each time a conservative judge is appointed, it's a struggle and requires compromise and negotiation. Okay, and so they've typically allowed, one, maybe two Supreme Court judges, is so that they're there and they can write their minority opinions, but they're never enough in the majority to change the nature of the decisions. And so today, the feeling is if we don't diversify the court, and in this case, we're not only talking about making sure we have a balance between liberal and conservative judges, but also a balance between the demographics of Israel. We want religious judges, we want secular judges, we want an Arab judge, we want a judge who comes from the outskirts, what's called the periphery of Israel, people who have new immigrants, people who are originally of a Sephardic background, people from an Ashkenazi European background, to have a variety, because the Supreme Court today really does not represent the country. And so I would say that up until very recently, there was an overwhelming majority of Israelis who were in favor of judicial reform, both to limit the court's authority to overturn Knesset legislation and to ensure that the court itself was more diversified and better represented the people of Israel. Bibi Netanyahu became prime minister. He was elected in November. He put together his government. It was already, I think, January. And one of the first things that this government did was to announce judicial reform. Now, this was not a surprise. This had been on the party platform, both in the Likud, but particularly in some of the other more right-wing parties. And Yariv Levin, who has been a very active Likud member and very, very powerful Likud member of Knesset, he has written on the subject of judicial reform and 20 years ago. So when people talk about, they're just putting forth this judicial reform in order to make it easier for Netanyahu to handle the criminal charges against him, that is not the case when you're talking about Yariv Levin, who, as I said, wrote these proposals 20 years ago, and even his opponents admit that he is coming from a purely ideological point of view. He's putting forth a conservative agenda. Same can be said with Rothman, another fellow, he's a member of Knesset, he's not a minister. And this fellow is also someone who wrote books and articles on this subject many, many years ago. He is now the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And these are the two people, Rothman and Levin, who are pushing forward this judicial reform more than anyone else. What has changed, and this is where the opponents may be correct. What has changed is these proposals for judicial reform were put up in various ways in previous Knessets when Netanyahu was the prime minister, and every single time he blocked it. Now, some people say he blocked it because he had division within his own party and he didn't think, or with some of his coalition partners, and he didn't think it could pass it. Others, more cynical, will say, no, he blocked it because he really is against it. He has a much more liberal take on the relationship between the Supreme Court and the Knesset, and therefore he's against it. However, when he suddenly realized that backing it may help his own criminal case, then he's in favor. I don't know. I can't tell you what Netanyahu is thinking. I can assure you that Levine and Rothman, who are the main people pushing this forward, as well as most of the people in the Likud, don't give a darn about Netanyahu's criminal case. What they do care about is correcting this imbalance that has been created over a number of years between the Supreme Court and the Knesset. Now, one of the things that's probably most aggravating to us, now I have to say I'm in favor of this judicial reform. However, I can recognize that some of the judicial reform may be a little too extreme. I understand what it's trying to accomplish, but it's very possible also that it is frightening, okay? It is frightening, and also as in any kind of law. Every time you pass a law in Israel, and I'm sure the same is all over, there is the text of the law, and then when you put forward the law to the Knesset, you have to write a paper that goes with it that, number one, explains what the law is, but also talks about the ramifications of this law. How will this affect all kinds of things that may not be automatically obvious to someone who's just reading the text of the law? So, for example, one of the things that is most controversial about this law is they've changed the way judges are appointed. And the point of the law is to diversify the court. So they want to give the politicians more of a say in how to appoint judges, so that the judges will reflect the demography, the democratically elected Knesset. And that makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, as we all know, not all politicians are righteous. And therefore, some politicians may use this power in an unrighteous way to illegally and unethically affect certain outcomes in certain cases that they may have a personal interest in. So I'm not denying that this is a fear. This is a very, very, very real fear. On the other hand, I could say as soon as anything is up to human beings, okay? And let's remember how we started our talk today about how human beings need to come before God and be willing to sacrifice. They also need to come before God with clean hands, okay? When you come and you say, this is what I believe we need to do, you have to make sure you're coming from a righteous place. We all know that both members of Knesset or members of any parliament, politicians and judges are not always coming before God with righteous hands. They're not always. And we've seen examples of this in the past where there have been personal interests, etc. So just because a judge has reached his judgeship by going through the whole process, he doesn't become Moses. He's still just a person with all his failings. And so this, of course, leads us to the crux of the problem. At one point, you're going to give one group of people more say over the other, either the politicians or the judges. Any one of them can be manipulative. Any one of them can come and not be righteous. And so this is what's going on. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in Israel today is that there's become, let's put it this way. When we went into these elections, there was, and all the surveys for the last number of years showed that there was an overwhelming drop in the trust and confidence that your average citizen of Israel put in the court system, and particularly in the Supreme Court. So there's no question that there is a problem that everybody recognizes, and you've got to do something to boost the confidence that the average citizen has in the Supreme Court. On the other hand, and again, you have a majority of the Knesset that represents the majority of the country, which is conservative. Also, within the parties that are today in the opposition, there are a number of key politicians who themselves were major proponents of judicial reform, almost identical to what is being put forward today. And yet today, they're the biggest opponents. No, this is terrible, this is terrible. Every so often, not often enough, because the media, unfortunately, this is one of our biggest problems. The media in this case has become overwhelmingly on the side of the opposition to the judicial reform. And that's part of our problem. It's a big part of our problem. So what's happened, though, is that you have, on the one hand, you have people who, they themselves were proponents of judicial reform. Then they come against this. And then on occasion, they're challenged. Now, wait a second. We remember, Mr. Saar, Mr. Elkin, you yourselves put forward very similar proposals for judicial reform. What's the difference? And then you see them making these well, it's not the same. We did it this way, did it that way. The differences are so minor. It's ridiculous. Okay. But what is really happening? And I think this is the problem. As I said, the media has overwhelmingly sided with the opposition to judicial reform. And as a result, the people running the demonstrations, and I really don't know who they are. That's one of the biggest question marks. I would wish if there was a more investigative media, I think we would have some research being done on who are these people. Because the way it's presented, and there really are, thousands of people, tens of thousands, and really, hundreds of thousands of people on any given major protest, because they're not only protesting in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, they're protesting all over the country. You put it together, there's clearly hundreds of thousands of people who are in the streets on a regular basis, in the rain, in the cold, on Saturday night, taking a day off from work, closing down the country. The protests are horrible, okay? And you have to ask yourself, what is fueling this? Because judicial reform, okay, I just gave you a glossy overview of it. Believe me, the nuts and bolts of it are so complicated, 99.9% of the country doesn't understand it. They can't possibly understand it. I happen to be a lawyer. I was trained also in American law and Israeli law, so I have the capability of understanding it. Nobody understands it if they don't have a legal background. So how can something so difficult to understand have raised so many passions to put so many people, hundreds of thousands, out in the streets? Well, I think they did something very clever. The opposition called it the end of democracy. We are on our way to a dictatorship. Now, why is that even believable? Because Netanyahu, okay, he's popular among those who vote for him. I have to tell you that even amongst many who voted for various right-wing parties, they don't like Netanyahu, but they admire his abilities and understand that he is the best person to lead the right wing in right-wing conservative policies. The left, on the other hand, for the most part, has developed this incredible hatred of Netanyahu. And it's not so much like a personal hatred, although you see that too. But what's particularly damaging is they don't trust him at all. He could get up and say, it is raining today, and they will say, I don't believe you. It's really sunny. In other words, it doesn't matter what he says. There are too many people in the country who don't believe him. And so that's become a real liability, because when you have a major judicial reform that's being put forward to the country, you need someone to be able to get up there and explain to all the country in a language that they can understand, not to worry. This is not the end of democracy. We just want to accomplish A, B, and C. Nobody's civil rights are going to be affected. We are not trying to take over a dictatorship. But he is saying very little. And when he is saying something, he's not inspiring confidence, which also is a big question mark for me. What really is going on there? At the same time, you have the left using words like end of democracy, dictatorship. Believe me, if you're in a country and you are seeing this major legislation being put forward and you didn't understand it because you're not a lawyer, and somebody who seems to be intelligent, including law professors and all kinds of other people, saying, guys, this is the end of your civil rights. This is end of democracy. Well, of course you're going to go out and protest in masses. You're going to go out and protest.
It's too early to call.
Yeah.
You are going to go out and protest because you're going to, everyone's going to be frightened by something like this. So what we're seeing today is real fear, not fueled because they are left or right. We have people on the right, not a lot, but some who are joining this protest because they have this sense that is being rammed through in a way that is not healthy, that is creating tensions, that they're not taking enough into account what other people have to say. What is aggravating this even further is some of the statements that some of the members of the coalition are saying. So, for example, we have ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition, and they decided right now, when all of this is going on, that they're going to want to put forth laws that are, I have to say, ridiculous. Okay. For example, a law was put forward. We want to ensure that men and women cannot be in a natural spring and some park somewhere at the same time. Now, your average person, I'm religious, and I see this and I say, what is this, Iran? We're walking around enforcing how people, follow their own religious dictates. You want to go swimming? Go swimming. You don't want to go swimming? Don't go swimming. What is this? It makes no sense. There have been other types of statements like this, which just fuels the fear in the country that what the right is trying to do in this judicial reform is to enable a theocracy. We also have the ultra-Orthodox that don't serve in the army. One of the reasons the ultra-Orthodox wants this judicial reform is because they want to ensure that their ultra-Orthodox people never have to serve in the army. Now, it is the Supreme Court who has said, excuse me, that's not fair. Why is it that Mr. Ultra-Orthodox doesn't have to serve in the army and Mr. Secular or religious Zionist does? Now, these are very complicated issues. And these are complicated issues that indeed need to be solved at the Knesset level, not necessarily at the court level. But I'm sure you can appreciate the fact that the average secular says, I need a Supreme Court to say, this law is not fair. And so all this stuff put together is creating a situation in the streets that people are saying, I'm afraid, I'm frightened. And what we don't have is, on the one hand, we have a majority, and I believe there's a silent majority that does support this judicial reform, but that same silent majority is also saying, but you got to speak nicer, and you have to reach out to the secular and even some of the traditional religious who are confused, and you have to calm them down, and you can't just go roughshod over this. Now, I have to say that if I look in total, there's no question in my mind that the way the left took this and the way they have been, the language they are using and pulling people out on the streets, I think if you have me to apportion blame, there's no question in my mind that the left has created the antagonism here, has created the fear. They've created it. That didn't have to be this way. But then what do they say? It's a bit cynical. What people say to them, but look at, why are you yelling and screaming so much? Why are you saying all these hateful things? Why don't you just talk? They say, well, the government, they're the ones in power, so they're the ones who really are in control. Well, it doesn't work like that, because the government is not controlling the streets. The opposition is controlling the streets. So unfortunately, this is a very difficult situation. This week, there's a new proposal that was being put forth by the government for a modified judicial reform, putting forth the legislation just with regard to how judges are appointed. I think they've made enormous compromises. But unfortunately, it's being met by scorn by the opposition, because here we have a sense of political getting involved. They have their own political interests. The left just wants to bring down this government, and it is really, really affecting the atmosphere in the country, and it is really affecting economics. It's affecting, investments. People are being hesitant about investing in Israel. And Mark, believe me, I don't think that judicial reform in any way negatively affects the economy. If anything, I could make the argument that it makes the economy more stable. The problem is that with any economic issue, it's psychology that affects more than anything else. And so foreign investors take a look and see these crazy demonstrations and people talking about the end of democracy going on week after week after week after week. They look at this and they say, I'm not going to put my head in the middle of this. This is a country that I don't have enough confidence in, because the people themselves don't have enough confidence in. I'm not going to invest in it. And that's the problem. And for this, I blame the left. And also, you have all these army generals who are saying, we're not going to come to reserve duty anymore. We're not going to fly our airplanes. Well, we're now facing a almost nuclear Iran. We can't afford to have these people in the army. Now, these lines have never been crossed. The army was always something that was it's sanctified. It is holy. You do not bring your political discussions into the army. And I'll just conclude this one thing with another comment. Many on the right, myself included, keep remembering what it was like in 2005, almost 20 years ago, when the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, in Gaza Strip, plus 4 communities in northern Samaria were forcibly uprooted. And thousands of people were forcibly removed from their homes in a way that seemed most undemocratic. And it wasn't just that it was a political decision, but they removed them from their homes at a time when they had no alternative homes available for them. And this case was brought before the Supreme Court, who said, you're violating our civil rights. You're throwing us out of our homes, which we own, which we bought with the permission of the government. Everything was legal. Okay. And now you're forcing us out of our homes, and you're not even giving us appropriate compensation or making sure we have another home. Why can't you wait on this for a while? And the Supreme Court supported the government decision. At the time, there were massive demonstrations taking place, and no one was allowed to block any major highways. There were kids who stepped off the curb for like 5 seconds, and they were already arrested. And the media had no sympathy for our cause. And so what we're seeing today is when the other side is feeling hurt, and let's say they are really hurt. Let's say it's a real fear. And I believe in many people it is a real fear. And they're demonstrating. But the tolerance for blocking the highways, the tolerance in the media for everything they're doing is so different. And so people like me and my children look at this and will say, this is not fair. Now, do we want the police to be as terrible as they were then? No, but we want for the left to understand when they're complaining over nothing, that they gave no credence to our complaints, that they don't. And even today, people are talking about this all the time. There is a lot being said today in the media. Right-wing people are given a voice, 100%. That just the people running the media are very left-wing, but they are interviewing some right-wing people who are saying, just remember what it was like for us during the disengagement in 2005. And almost always the interviewers are saying, it's not the same. It's irrelevant. Never, and so much could happen, I think, to bring peace and understanding if each side would be able to look at the other side and say, I don't agree with you, but I understand where you're coming from. I understand your pain. And they have to say this to us, and we have to say this to them. And what I'm seeing among ordinary people is that a lot of people on the right are saying to the left, I understand your pain, but I don't agree with it. But we're still waiting for people on the left to turn to us and say, I understand the pain that you've carried with you for 20 years from the disengagement. So I don't really have any optimistic things to say today, other than I think we need prayer. And I'm hoping that the underlying solidarity that has always characterized Israel will at some point shine through. And this will not go beyond some nasty rhetoric and uncomfortable demonstrations. The left talking about civil war is not helping. I don't think we're on the verge of civil war, but I definitely think the tensions are something that are very unfortunate, and they should not happen. Just one more thing now, that if we talked about the disengagement, wonderful news last night from the Knesset. Part of the disengagement, the legal part of the disengagement, was to make it illegal for Jews to be in the Gaza Strip and in the 4 communities in northern Samaria that were evacuated and destroyed. And last night in the Knesset reversed the law that made it illegal for Jews to be in northern Samaria, in those 4 communities. There has been a group of people since that destruction of the community of Chomesh that have been eager to go back and have actually been there illegally over the years. They set up a yeshiva, a Bible school there. that was recently destroyed. There were different arrangements that were made and that have been violated. And now it is legal. And what that means is that there's no way to prevent a Jew from going back to Chomesh, living there, building up the houses again, putting up the yeshiva, whatever, turning it into a regular community. This is a community that was legal. Okay, it was always legal. And it was only this law that reversed its legality when it was passed in 2005. And now that law was reversed. So now we go back to the original legal status of these communities, Chomesh, Sanur, Ganim, and Kadin. But the focus right now is on Chomesh. This is where we have a group of people that are just so eager to go back and reestablish it. And I hope you will join me in hoping that they do succeed. I would love to see Chomesh as one of our communities of the month at the point at which actually people are living there. So we will look forward to that, please God. So that's really what I have to say today. I do want to leave some time for questions because I know I presented a lot of information and a bit of controversy, but now's the opportunity. If anybody wants to ask any questions, maybe Joy, you can help monitor the questions so we don't talk at the same time.
Perhaps raise your hand on your Zoom if you've got a question so that we can try and do this in an orderly manner. I'd like to ask Sondra, I mean, heaven forbid that this happens, but if, say, Iran did attack or Hezbollah, or there was a full-on war again from Gaza, do you think the country would unite?
I have to believe that, yes. I have to believe, and many of the army people that we hear being interviewed are saying that they believe that these are more threats to put pressure on the government than actual refusal to serve. But again, there's a real problem in the way it was responded to. For example, there were a group of pilots, or they're reserve pilots, because anyone in the regular force is not able to say anything political. But if you're reserve, then you're an ordinary civilian, and you're only really under the Army's authority when you're called for reserve. So these are the people who are saying, we won't, come if we are drafted to fly that plane and bomb Iran or whatever. They're just saying they're not going to come. But they're saying it in a funny way. They're saying, well, if this legislation passes, then it will become a dictatorship, and then we clearly do not have to serve a dictatorship, which is, really, really nuts. But there are people who are saying that it's not that they're saying they won't come. They won't come if it's a dictatorship, which is also theoretical, and it will never happen. So the whole thing is a bit ridiculous. But it is affecting the morale of the army, and I do know that the chief of staff and the minister of defense are extremely concerned about this, because it has brought the political discussion into the army, and that is not right. But I do believe, I can't imagine that if we are being attacked, we will not be able to muster all the forces we need to respond.
Yes, John, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just a comment and then a question. A comment is, in the UK, the coverage from the BBC has been very much slanted towards the left, in the sense that they promote the narrative that democracy is threatened in Israel. That was my comment. The other one really is a question. Sondra, you mentioned demographics. What is the trajectory of demographics in Israel between the different groups? Is there any sort of trend that's expected, or?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, yes, the BBC has actually always been very anti-Israel, but most of the media in Israel, and much more so around the world, is really adopting the left narrative on this, which is of course creating so much more of the economic issues. And it's really unfortunate. With regard to demographics, the country has changed, and this is really, I would say, what lies at the source of a lot of what's going on today. The country is a much more traditional, much more conservative country than it was 20 years ago. Religious families have many more children. More and more secular families are becoming more religious or more traditional, coming back to an appreciation of the Bible, God, etc. And that's the trajectory, if you will.
Yeah.
Things are going from overwhelmingly secular to more and more religious. So we're the only Western country that is more religious today than we were 20 years ago. And so what's happening is, I believe this is one of the things fueling. It's not I don't like Bibi. No, not at all. That's not what's fueling this. It's just because so many people don't like Bibi, it's making it more difficult for him to kind of calm everyone down. But what's fueling this is what I would call the swan song of a shrinking minority. A secular people that at the beginning of the state kind of ran things and felt that, okay, there's a few religious people, they'll stay over there, they'll stay in the corner, but they won't affect policy. And the way this really started changing was with the settlement movement, because that was back in the 70s. That was the first time that religious people with a biblical vision put forward a policy that wasn't just about making it easier to be religious. You don't have to work on Sabbath or something like that, but put forward a policy that had a vision for the whole country, and that clearly affected the whole country. The settlement movement affects everything, and has affected, of course, our international relations in many ways. And so that already began in the 70s, but that has just grown because more and more people are in a position where they sympathize and they feel this way. And so what you're seeing now are secular people looking around and saying, this government came into being a right-wing government. And even some of the people in the opposition are also really right-wing, and the only reason they're in the opposition is because Netanyahu is the prime minister. If someone else would be the prime minister, our coalition government would not represent 64, it would probably represent 84 seats. And so the people who are now at the secular left-wing thing are realizing they will never be a majority. And so this is kind of, their last attempt to try to change that balance.
Yeah, because one of the things that actually affects the UK and a lot of Western European countries with the immigration is the immigrants tend to have more children per woman than the indigenous population. Right.
So in our case, we're all indigenous, but yes, the religious do have more children, and that's definitely making a difference.
Okay, thanks, Sondra.
You're welcome.
Marion.
You're muted, Marion.
You travel a lot, Sondra. You've just come back from the Netherlands and you go to America a lot. It's happening over there too. In their governments, the left are swallowing everything up in rapid speed, and most people are shaking their heads and saying, I don't understand what's going on. And I'm sure the Netherlands, I've heard, is in as big a mess as any other European country. On the weekend, Sondra, we had people standing on the Parliament steps of Victoria saluting with a Hitler, Heil Hitler. We have Nazis who would not let some women have a voice that they want to be women. Now, it's just a sign, I'm sorry to say, of something that is happening globally. And you started this meeting. I know it's not a question, but I just want to add into the time we're living. And you started this Zoom with the most beautiful way anyone could start it, to talk about the Almighty. And he doesn't need us, but he wants us, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
And, sadly, in our day, we, and I'm sure those of similar faith to me listening will agree that we will hang on to his zitzits, if I can put it like that, because we see people who have no God and are their own God are getting swallowed up with great deceptions. And sadly for all of us, and I just want to cry that it's happening in Israel, because you've been brought back to have your own place and it's all gone well, in the midst of it is not just people with a lot of different, look, the United Kingdom is no longer a Judeo-Christian country. That's the truth of it. So, and I mean, that doesn't bring any comfort to us much, but it does say, let's wake up and know what really is going on. And keep comforting each of us, like yourself, Sondra, that we're going to believe that God will come through in the end. He'll let it play out. We both believe Messiah's coming, and this is going to have to happen, you know, to bring him back or bring him forward. And I mean, I said to friends today, would you have ever believed in Victoria at the Parliament we would have Nazis saluting? And they have turned out to be the heroes. The
and
women,
the police allowed it, didn't they? The police allowed it.
That's crazy.
You know,
that's
the
nuts.
innocent ones are seemingly never, it's turned on them, that they become the victim. And anyway, I just thank you for the way you started it. Keep going with those beautiful words of inspiration from the Bible.
Amen.
Will keep us going. And God never changes, and he's looking for people who will just trust him right through all of this. And even what's happening in Israel, he sees it, he knows it, and he's still wanting to hear from those who believe in him and trust him and hope for all the good things that will be brought out of it.
I lovely Marian. I really agree with what you said. The one thing I do want to point out, though, the major difference between what's going on in other countries and what's going on in Israel. In other countries, in Europe in particular, but also to a certain degree in America, the left is indeed growing. And the ideas of a left, and particularly a progressive left, are indeed capturing the imaginations and the votes of more and more people. This has already happened in Europe, and it's unfortunately happening to a very great degree in America, although in America it's still a debate. In other words, it's not like progressives have taken over, but the Democratic Party has become more and more progressive as opposed to where it used to be kind of center left. And the right has to put forth viable leaders to be able to combat that, but they still have that opportunity to do that. Europe is finished. You know, people in Europe, democratically passed laws are very progressive, and people, though, that minority, and I've talked, like I was in Holland and I've talked to people in Europe, they are indeed a minority. They do not have the numbers to sway things in a different way. The most they can do is get recognition that they at least are able to do certain things in their own schools or whatever, and that is also a problem. In Israel, the trend is the opposite. Our trend is away from progressive. More and more people are more conservative, more traditional, and this is not changing it. And what's sad about this whole thing is that these people are being manipulated because it's judicial reform, and nobody really understands what it is anyway. And if they were going to try to get a lot of people on the streets to protest against the government just because they don't want a conservative policy, they wouldn't get these numbers at all. But they were smart enough to take this idea of judicial reform, match it with end of democracy, and suddenly you have people on the streets that really don't belong there. Okay. And that's really, you know, our challenge today is to communicate much more than it is to put forth this or that policy. If we can succeed in communicating and getting people to understand what's really about and what it's not about, I think we would be all right. But that's a huge challenge because of media and social media. And as you all know, social media skews things, you know, so people who are interested in a left-wing opinion, that's all they're getting is a left-wing opinion on their feeds. And they're not seeing the balance. And this is, look, that's a thing that all of us are dealing with, both right and left. You know, the skewed way things are presented through the algorithms of social media. And so that the extremes are brought to the forefront much more than this moderate middle where people are able to have conversation, which is the same thing with the Nazis. The Nazis are able to go there and they have support today because they're an extreme, and Facebook loves extremes. or any of these other platforms. It doesn't matter what the extreme is. They love extreme. Why? Because extreme sells things. People get heated up and then they get more engaged.
But we know
anyway,
the end of the story. You have to go, Sondra.
Yes.
It's 8 o'clock. Well, it's 8
Right.
o'clock here in
Yes, and it's noon,
Queensland,
and I have to go
you
to
have
Catania and pick up lovely Americans from North Carolina to bring them to see Samara.
Yes.
Oh,
So
it's
thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you,
Sondra.
everybody.
Sondra,
Thank you.
and we'll see you
your
next time.
viewers.
Thank you, yes.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that film. And we have lots more film content and emails and articles that I'm sure you will enjoy as well. Check out our website at cfoic.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that right from the homepage. I know you will really enjoy the content that will land in your inbox on a regular basis. Hope to see you soon.